Kurt Loder with an MTV News special report. The body of Nirvana leader Kurt Cobain was found in a house in Seattle on Friday morning, dead of an apparently self-inflicted shotgun blast to the head. Police found what is said to be a suicide note he'd seen, but had not yet divulged its contents. Cobain, who was 27, had reportedly been missing for several days. The Los Angeles Times reported on Wednesday that Nirvana was breaking up and Cobain was planning to undergo drug rehabilitation.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Ange Endeavor. Today's venture takes us into part 4 of my Nirvana series. This is the finale of the 4-part series of my Nirvana story. But before we begin, I just want to say thank you to all of the viewers who came on this journey and the new subscribers that subscribe to the channel and all of the ones that have been with me since 2018. I greatly appreciate it. I appreciate all of the lovely comments, and I'm really glad that that you really enjoyed the story. In the intro of Kurt Loder on MTV announcing the death of Kurt Cobain was a shock to the world. It was untimely and unexpected. Where my story begins is how I came to find out that Kurt died. So picture it. Seattle, Washington, Friday, April 8th, 1994. I was headed over to Chris and Shelley's house that morning, and they were going to go out of town, so I was going to be house sitting. So I, at the time, was working a swing shift job at that prestigious photo lab I was telling you about, IVC Right. And so my work didn't start until 3 o'clock, so I worked a swing shift, and I had to go over to Chris and Shelley's to pick up the keys that morning. So I got there around 11, I think. I can't remember, but it was the morning time, and I was going to get the keys and hang out with Shelley for a bit. And Chris was already away at the place that they were going to go away to for the weekend. And I remember going to the door, to their door. I remember knocking on the door and there was no answer. And I thought, I wonder what's going on. Where's Shelley? And I turn around and I see her coming from across the street. And she was at a neighbor's, and she was crying, and she told me that Kurt had died. And I was just totally shocked. I couldn't believe it. So we went into the house, and she said that she got a call that he had overdosed, or they thought it was an overdose. So, of course, there wasn't a cell phone to call Chris, and so she had to wait till he got to his destination to get a hold of him. And so he was on his way back up to Seattle. Meanwhile, we're really upset, and some friends were coming over, and it wasn't until that Kurt Loder MTV video that we found out that it was a suicide. And we were just dumbfounded. It was a really, really crazy day. And I remember, how upset everybody was. And I was too upset to even go into work. So, I called out. And then the news came, and they pulled up front. And so a friend of Chris and Shelley's was out there kind of being a bouncer, and saying, hey, can you just leave us alone while we process this, give us our privacy. And so the news were kind and did leave. But it was just, it was a shock. It was unbelievable, really. There was a lot of commotion going on that morning, and one of the things I remember was that Kurt's car was in front of the house, and it was a 1965 baby blue Dodge Dart. And I remember going and looking at the car, and I saw there was a baby car seat for Frances Bean in the back. And Shelley said that they had tried to do an intervention a couple of days earlier, and that's why Kurt's car was there. I have some film footage from in front of the house when I was there the last video, and I point out where the car was sitting, and then I'll also show you a photograph of the actual car itself. So I'm back here at Chris and Shelley's old house, and one thing I wanted to share was when Kurt Cobain passed away, I came here that day way back in 1994, and he had a baby blue 1965 Dodge Dart parked right out in front here. So the question was, why was Kurt Cobain's car sitting in front of Chris Novoselic's house? And somehow I had in my mind that that he had left it there during an intervention. I can't remember what the story was. There was a story around a big intervention, but I went and looked online and found this little tidbit, and it said the 1965 Dodge Dart was found parked in front of Chris Novoselic's house April 7th, 1994, because a friend had moved it there while Kurt Cobain was missing. So apparently during that time he was missing, and his friend had moved it there from another location. It further goes on to say here, moved during the search. While Cobain was missing after fleeing rehab, his inner circle was frantically searching for him. During this chaotic window, someone close to Cobain moved the baby blue Dart away from his Lake Washington home and parked it on the street outside of Novoselic's residence. So I guess a friend left it there. And so when I got there the next day, it was there. So I want to go back to that weekend that we found out Kurt died. I stayed there that whole weekend, and I'm not going to divulge too much information because it's really personal, and these are people that I loved and cared about, and I just want to be respectful of what their process was. But I'll share one little thing is I remember that Friday evening, Chris and Shelley went over to Courtney and Kurt's house, that famous Lake Washington house. And Chris was having a hard time believing that this was true. And I know kind of what took place there. And when he came home, he told me that, basically it confirmed all of his fears around that this was true, that his friend was gone and had taken his life. And so, and there were some other things he shared with me that happened that weekend that, I just will keep private, but we'll just say that it was very, just a very sad and dark time period for everybody. Part of the other thing that was going on that weekend was the issue around Courtney Love. Now, there again, I can't talk about a lot because I just want to be respectful, but it isn't any secret. It's all out there in public to look up, but there was a lot of division in the band between Kurt and Courtney, and then with Chris and Dave and Pat Smear. So, but a lot of that division, aside from the heroin use, was nobody really liked Courtney. And it wasn't because they didn't like her just to not like her, because actually, you know, all of those guys are very, very caring people and didn't seem to be judgmental towards anybody. Their dislike of Courtney is stems from the fact that they felt she was using Kurt. And from everything that I had heard privately, I believe that that is very much the truth. There was certainly a difference, like Kurt, you know, he just cared about having an old car, a nice old car to drive, and she was more about having a Lexus. She wanted the expensive, fancy things. She was kind of a glamour queen. She wanted the fame. She, you know, so she, and then a lot of the times she tended to blame the heroin use on Kurt and saying that he had the problem. Well, she had the problem too, major problems. And so there was a lot of infidelity on her part. And this is, like I said, this is not hidden. This is public knowledge. Just never felt like there was any sincerity with her around her loving care of Kurt. I mean, I'm sure there was, but when you have two people using heroin like they were using heroin, is there really any love? I really just never believed that she cared for Kurt, not in a genuine way. And given all of the stories that I had heard, and she, you know, I mean, you've seen the documentaries where she really wanted to be famous or be with somebody famous so she could be famous. And it's not any surprise that soon after he died, she goes and releases her first album, Live Through This, by Hole. And I just thought, you know, if I was a grieving widow, if I lost my person, I would be inconsolable for probably a couple of years at least. It just seemed like all kinds of wrong. There was something not right about that whole situation. It was a very big, giant mess. And everybody was, you know, just having a rough time. And you know, I think about it and about Chris and Shelley and their relationship with Kurt. I mean, they had known, especially Shelley, she knew Kurt like most of her life with him in Aberdeen. And Chris knew him since they were teenagers. And so Chris and Shelley always looked out for him. I remember, you know, that he would be camping out on their couch when they were living in Aberdeen. There was a genuine love, you know, and actually I'm going to put this picture up that Shelley had taken, and this is also in the public. So, and this is how I remember them. You know, these two young kids in Aberdeen who just loved to play music and hung out and were goofy, you know, and so here, I'll put that here. I can't imagine what Shelley and Chris were going through themselves, because you see, even though Dave came on the scene and everybody else was there through the Nirvana stuff, this was a family member. This was somebody they truly loved. That, I mean, only the three of them knew what Aberdeen was like. And so not only losing Kurt Cobain, but Chris Novoselic lost his band. And I think that that death really changed him, and it changed Shelley, and it changed everybody else. How could it not? I mean, it's, you know, if a fan, and I consider myself a fan more than anything, or any fan, who loves a musician or a singer-songwriter because their music touched you in some way, or their story touched you, and they die tragically, it certainly changes you. One of the things that I wanted to mention that Shelley shared with me is, if you remember in my intro, you saw that little bouquet of flowers and it said "Forget Me Not." Well, Shelley told me that forget-me-not flowers were Kurt's favorite flowers, and I thought it would be appropriate to put that there. But that's how well, how close they were, and so for them, it went deeper than I would say than everybody else. And then you wrap the whole fame around it, and the whole, he got with a partner, Courtney Love, who was not a supportive partner and was not a good person. I mean, he was already suffering from, heroin addiction, but he had a lot of emotional and mental problems that had never been resolved. I don't know if he ever tried therapy or counseling, but his music was his therapy. And so, in some ways, that was even taken away from him. The days that led up to Kurt's death were really, really chaotic. I'll share with you what I found. So back in March of 1994, so this was a month before Kurt died, they were touring and they were in Rome, and Kurt Cobain had overdosed. So it said that Cobain was rushed to Rome's Umberto Hospital and later transferred to an American hospital where he remained comatose for roughly 20 hours before regaining consciousness. Looks like there was some kind of a public cover-up. It said management and publicists initially told the press and fans that the near-fatal incident was an accidental reaction to prescription drugs and severe exhaustion, bronchitis, to protect his privacy on the ongoing tour. But the hidden truth was people close to the situation later confirmed Rome was actually a deliberate suicide attempt, not noting that Kurt had left a suicide note in the hotel room. So on his return to Seattle, after recovering physically, Cobain flew back to Seattle, where friends and family noted his behavior grew increasingly erratic, depressed, and isolated in the following weeks. An intervention was organized shortly before his death. So that I know was the truth. After Kurt came back, so that was the 4th of March that happened. Then he came back after he recovered. And I remember Chris and Shelley, I was visiting them one time and they were both really upset. And they told me that they had tried this intervention with Kurt and a bunch of others, and he had actually come to the house and he was completely just unraveled and, totally erratic and going nutty. And so they tried to get him into the car because they wanted to do this intervention. And he kicked and screamed. And Shelley told me for the first time, Chris told him that he quit. There were also stories that said that Chris was actually driving Kurt to the airport to take him so he could fly to Los Angeles to check himself into the rehab place. and that there was a big fight that happened, and that Kurt tried to jump out of the car and Chris had to grab him, and so that there was a lot of struggling. I don't remember that story, but you know, there must be some truth to it because it's out there and it seems to be public knowledge. I'm just trying to go off of what I remember that I was told. I do know he was spiraling out of control, and it was a big concern. There was just a lot of stuff going on at that time. I do remember that when the Rome incident happened, the overdose happened, I was visiting some family in another state, and I saw it on TV, and I called Shelley, you know, just to see what was going on. And thankfully he wasn't dead, but they thought that he had died, you know, and then they found out that he didn't. So it was just that way. Like, it seemed like from that time, around that time, things just went downhill really quickly. There was a heaviness after that, and that heaviness and that dark cloud remained, you know, and how could it not? I think that everybody was trying to grapple with what was happening, that what happened, first you have the initial shock and the disbelief, and then the realization that it is true, that he's gone, Kurt Cobain's gone, and Nirvana is gone. So you lose your bandmate, you lose your best friend since your teenage years and your childhood, and you know what, and so much was put into that. So think about it. Since the Aberdeen days, all of those hours of practicing, and you know, all of those songs, and how deep that is to create music together with other musicians, and to know all of their secrets, you know, to know who they are and how they tick and everything. And you know, I can imagine it was that way for Chad Channing and anybody else that was close, you know, from the Melvins or Mudhoney, all of those guys that they were all good friends from that area. So after the death of Kurt Cobain, the next thing, so he died April 5th, he was found April 8th. The following month was May, and we're gonna roll into the month of May and Chris Novoselic's birthday. And so he had been feeling down, and I could tell that there was a change in him and Shelley. There was a change in everything. The vibe was not the same. So that's what happens with grief, right? It's what happens with grief. So I want to touch on grief, especially grief after a loved one commits suicide, or any tragic way that they go, whether somebody took their life, or whether they took their own life, or even if it was an accident. But we'll just hover around the suicide. And what I looked up and found is online about grief after a loved one has committed suicide. And I did this because I wanted to give context to what was really going on, even unbeknownst to myself and maybe, you know, all of the rest of us that were in that circle, because you have to kind of come at it from an emotional and psychological place to get understanding. And I think in some ways that's kind of where some healing can happen, you know, because suicide and a sudden death like that is pretty big. So it says here, and this is Google, so grief after a loved one dies by suicide is often called complicated grief or traumatic grief. It is deeply intense, uniquely painful, and vastly different from grieving a natural death because it leaves the survivors with severe psychological hurdles. Here is what happens to a person navigating the aftermath of suicide. Here's a little, I'm going to move a little further on here. The endless loop. Grievers become trapped in a mental loop, trying to piece together the final days, hours, and minutes. The illusion of control. The mind struggles to accept that the answer may never be fully known, leading to an exhausting, obsessive search for explanations. Overwhelming guilt and blame. What ifs? Survivors almost always blame themselves. They replay the past conversations, wishing they had said something different or noticed a hidden sign. Anger and resentment. It is common to feel intense anger at the deceased for leaving, followed immediately by severe guilt for feeling that anger. The weight of stigma and isolation. Social awkwardness. Friends and acquaintances often do not know what to say. And that's in the case of the group that we were in. I don't think none of us knew what to say. I don't think any of us knew how to, in our 20-something minds, our Gen X minds, knew how to comprehend it. They may avoid the grieving person out of discomfort, leading to profound isolation. The hush effect. Families sometimes hide the cause of death due to social stigma or religious shame, which forces survivors to carry the trauma completely alone. Psychological and physical trauma. I think this one's a good one. It really ties it in. Survivors may experience flashbacks, severe anxiety, and panic attacks, especially if they were the one to discover the body or the suicide note. High risk. Statistically, suicide loss survivors are at a significantly higher risk for depression, complicated grief, and their own suicidal ideation. And it says what helps the healing process. Suicide loss support groups. Being around peers who have lost someone to suicide is crucial. It removes the stigma and allows survivors to speak openly without being judged. Trauma-informed therapy, grief counseling, traditional grief counseling, relinquishing responsibility. Healing begins when a survivor gradually accepts that they are not responsible for the choices, mental illness, or ultimate actions of another person. Back then, none of us went to grief counseling. Back then, I think we were dealing with it all as best as we could in our own little worlds. I know for me, I certainly was struggling at that time. It was just eerie, It was eerie, sad, depressing. And so I did notice a change in Chris. I don't think he wasn't himself, and I don't think he knew how to be. How could you be, right? I don't think he knew what to do with all of that. I don't know if he ever went to counseling for the loss of his friend. I don't know whatever happened around that, because once again, we're all in our late 20s, and I don't know that we knew what to do with it. So 1994 was a pretty intense year. There were a lot of cataclysmic changes in all of our lives. We were also in the throes of our Saturn return, and trying to grapple with what happened. Not only just with Kurt Cobain and Nirvana all of a sudden ending, but we all had our own individual struggles as well. 1994 was not just a year of tragedy, but it was also the year of new beginnings and introductions. And such was the case in May. So Chris Novoselic was born May 16th, and Shelley wanted to have a party for him. And I had it in my head, knowing Chris and Shelley and their musical taste, because they weren't just into alternative music, they were into world music, many different genres. Chris really loved Mexican music, and you know, they introduced me to all of that kind of stuff too, you know, world music. And my friend Eva Tapia that I mentioned before, who was a Seattle street musician, she was a Venezuelan folk singer, and also they did punk rock. I knew that they were a punk rock singer, so I thought maybe I would approach Shelley about seeing if we could get my friend Eva to serenade to Chris for his birthday. You know, maybe to help him, you know, feel a little better. And so I brought it up to Shelley, and Shelley thought that was a great idea. And I told her about Eva's genre and her varied musical background. And Shelley thought maybe we should hire Eva to perform for Chris, like more than just a serenade. And so that's what happened. And I'll show you a picture again briefly of Eva. So yeah, so Eva went and brought along their friend. I can't remember what his name was, but we had them show up to Chris's party, and Chris was really surprised. And Eva showed up with the little cuatro guitar, and their friend showed up with a regular guitar, and Eva was totally, like, you know, impressing Chris. And I knew that that would happen because Eva is very talented. She was talented then and now. And so Chris was very, very pleased with that. And I was hoping that that meeting would form something, you know, that something would happen out of it. And it did. It did. So Chris was so impressed with Eva's raw voice and guitar playing, he wanted to record Eva. And eventually that turned into wanting to jam with Eva. And so they eventually formed their band Sweet 75. And Sweet 75 was able to sign with Geffen Records, which was also Nirvana's label. This here is their DGC promotional photo. Here is another DGC promotional photo for Sweet 75. And here's one that I took at one of their shows. This was Sweet 75's debut album. It was the only album they made as a band, and unfortunately in 1999, the band split up over creative differences. That was really exciting. I was hoping, you know, that it would be a good thing for both of them, you know, and it was. It gave them each something for a while, and Dave Grohl that summer released of 94, he released his Foo Fighters debut album. And then in August of that year, 1994, I got to go camping with Eddie Vedder. And so how that happened was there was the Garlic Festival was happening up in Arlington, and it was a big piece of farmland owned by this Love Israel family. It was some kind of like weird culty, you know, family that lived on this farm. So kind of like a hippie farm, you know. But the Garlic Festival, you know, was held there annually as far as I know. And Shelly, I went to Shelly and Chris's, and she's like, oh yeah, we're waiting for Eddie. And I was like, oh, okay, Eddie who? Eddie Vedder. I was like, oh my God. So Eddie Vedder was coming with us, and I was, and also at that point, Eva and Eva's partner came, and Brenda and Ernie and a few other people. So there was a number of us going to this, and we were going to be camping there, and it was really, really cool. I actually was able to take one picture of the group of them. Well, Chris and Ernie weren't in it, but with Eddie Vedder, and I'll show that here, and you'll see you can't really see Eddie clearly, and I was trying to be really casual about it because it was Eddie Vedder. I know here I'm friends with like these people from Nirvana, and I'm nervous about Eddie Vedder, and I wasn't even a Pearl Jam fan either. So it was just so weird, but so I'll show that picture now. And then I found a couple of other photographs online from Reddit that I wanted to share from that. So by the time, so Eddie Vedder made an impromptu performance on the stage there, and Chris and Ernie played on stage with them, and I couldn't get any pictures because it was evening and I didn't have a flash. So I found a couple of pictures online, which I'll show here. And they performed Helter Skelter by the Beatles. And it was really, really good. One of the highlights I remember about that trip to Arlington was I got to sit and talk with Eddie Vedder for a little while. I don't even remember what we talked about. But one thing I do remember was that he was really depressed, and because he had lost his rabbit died. And I was told that he was very sensitive, and I think, from that conversation, it's like that was true. He's very sensitive, very sweet and kind. And his wife at the time, Beth, was there, and she and I talked for a while. She was an artist in her own right too. But I can't remember the conversations. I was 27 years old, so, or I was actually still 26, going to be 27. So when Eddie Vedder came over to the house, I was like, I just didn't even know what to say, so I didn't really say much of anything. From Chris and Shelly's house, we had decided to stop over at the nearby 7-Eleven. And when I was filming there for the last vlog, I saw the 7-Eleven, so I filmed a little bit of footage of that 7-Eleven where we went to, and Eddie parked his car. He had some vintage brown car, and it was parked off to the side, and he was too scared to go into 7-Eleven because he didn't want to be recognized. And I felt sorry for him because, it's like you're kind of a prisoner when you become a famous person like that. You can't just go anywhere. So, that was a really interesting, fond memory. So I'll show that footage here. Okay, this 7-Eleven that I'm filming here, I had forgotten until now, as I just drove by it, there is an Eddie Vedder memory here. Oh my gosh, this 7-Eleven brings back memories. So, when we were going to go camping up in Arlington, Eddie Vedder was going to join us, and so he and his girlfriend and all of us came to this 7-Eleven, and he parked his car like right along over there. And he didn't want to go into the 7-Eleven because he was afraid of being recognized. So I remember, oh, that's too bad. He can't just come in with the rest of us and get goodies, because I think we were getting snacks and filling up on gas, getting ready to head up north. So that was pretty fun day. Pretty fun day, I remember. So after the summer that we went and spent time at Arlington Garlic Festival, and then the next few years that happened up into 1999, I would say that, what happened to all of us? What happened to all of us? I think, and what happened to Kurt Cobain, he was 27 when he killed himself. I was 26 going on 27. Shelley was 27. I think Chris was 28 or 29. I can't remember. But I think about that time, and I mentioned earlier about, well, heck, we were in our late 20s. We were going through our first Saturn returns. And to further understand it, I went and looked up Saturn returns because it wasn't just Kurt. He didn't make it. He checked out, I want to share what a Saturn return means in astrology, astrologically speaking. It says here in Google, your first Saturn return is a cosmic reality check that happens between ages 27 and 30. When the planet Saturn moves back into the exact spot it occupied in the sky when you were born. In astrology, this 3.5 to 3 year transition marks your official initiation from youth into true adulthood, forcing you to take heavy accountability for your life path. Man, is that not heavy or what? It also says that it's a cosmic coming of age. This period forces you to stop living for your parents' or society's expectations and start defining yourself for yourself. Structural accountability. Saturn represents discipline and hard work. It highlights areas where you have slacked off, ignored responsibility, or built on a weak foundation. Relationship shifts. You may experience major breakups, divorces, deep realignments in friendships as your personal standards and boundaries change. Career and life direction. It is common to face sudden job losses, complete career pivots, or sudden urge to pursue long-term stability instead of temporary for now jobs. Common life changes and signs. Internal upheaval, feeling lost, overwhelmed, anxious about the future, or experiencing a general identity crisis about who you are becoming. Outgrowing the past, realizing old habits, coping mechanisms, and party lifestyles no longer serve your physical or mental health. Rebuilding, consciously restructuring your life brick by brick to align with your authentic values, and so on. And I'm like, oh my God, was that a huge cosmic upheaval? Here this whirlwind happens. This kid from Aberdeen, these kids from Aberdeen who formed a band. They call it grunge, but it really is just a rock and roll band. They call it punk, but it's a rock and roll band. And they make it big in such an unusual way, unheard of way, overnight, literally. It took the world by storm overnight. And when you're in your 20s, when you move into your 20s, your only point of reference is your youth, your teenage years, your childhood years. And if you haven't had a chance to decipher those and work through those and delineate what was going on, and never having any therapy, it can cause a lot of issues. And then all of a sudden you become this big famous rock star, and somebody who had a lot of instabilities those instabilities grew worse, and the people surrounding him we all had our demons. And where did we go after that? Well, just like it says, the relationships, all of the relationships, everything was unraveling. Kurt Cobain died, Nirvana ceased, and people were upset with each other. Things fell apart. All of our pain and suffering were surfacing. And by the time 1995 rolled around, it was even growing increasingly more so. I started seeing a counselor who ended up becoming a mentor and a true teacher to me. And I was becoming unraveled myself, dealing with my own history and my own past. And I know that, the others were all dealing with their personal demons and were coming unraveled. And what happened, just like what happened with Kurt, is that it exploded and everything just scattered to the winds. And relationships ended, and people were, in disagreements, and it was just all over the place. And we were all in our Saturn returns, and nothing made sense. We were topsy-turvy. And then, we scattered to the winds, going about our lives in different directions. The thing that brought us together, this Nirvana entity, well, for me, Chris and Shelley, was Aberdeen. That's where my roots were with them. But then, Ernie came along, and everybody else came along after. And it was a time of changes. It was a time where it was a time for us to start embarking on our adulthood from childhood. And this tragic thing happened to one of our peers. And that's what it was really about. I mean, it's human. It just happened to be a public thing, but it happens to human beings all over the world all the time. And I know that I continued on with my own inner work for years and years, and I'm always working on myself. I'm always grappling. I wouldn't say grappling. I think I'm done grappling. I think I finally am moving into, I'm in my second Saturn return, and I think I'm moving into my true being after all of that, all those years of that. And I hope that everybody else is too, that survived. The one thing that I learned from all of that, well, there were some takeaways that I got that I want to share. First of all, I recently had a teacher in college tell me something really important I learned. And she said, bring your learning forward. You have a whole history. What did you learn? What did you learn? And bring that learning forward. Did you make some mistakes along the way? Did you do some self-introspection, and did you correct it? Did you correct your mistakes? Did you finally love yourself? Did you finally have an understanding of what was really going on with yourself all of those years ago and everything that leads up to the present moment? I think that I still have growing to do. I think that we all do. But that was that point. Bring your learning forward. And then the other point was Chris and Shelley introduced me to a whole world that I might not ever have been introduced to. Shelley introduced me to Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, and lent me a book one time called The Miracle of Mindfulness. And that was a game shifter. They also, like I mentioned before, were into other kinds of music, not just alternative music or punk rock. They liked Dead Can Dance. They liked jazz and blues, and they liked the Jackson 5. They liked hip hop. They liked many genres of music. They were not just about one kind, and that was the beauty. It's like I learned from them that there were other worlds artistically and musically to explore. So I love pretty much most genres of music, and later in life have come to love jazz. Like jazz, in the last, I'd say 15 years, has entered into my life in a really profound way. And but neo soul, just so much. There's so much really wonderful expressions of music and art, and I'm just really grateful to Chris and Shelley, and Kurt Cobain, and Dave Grohl, and Pat Smear, and Ernie Bailey, for introducing me to another realm. Kurt didn't make it this lifetime, and maybe he wasn't meant to. He didn't make it past his Saturn return. And sometimes, because it's so difficult, the Saturn return can be very painful for a young person. And if you don't have the right support system, or the knowledge of it even, you might have a really tough time or not make it. Anyways, in closing, I will always love those people for what they brought into my life at that time, because I too had a difficult life, like many of us have had difficult lives, and music and art and things get us through those times. And it's something that I will be always grateful for. I'm really glad that I got to share this, and I hope that if anything, if there can be any healing that comes out of somebody else taking their own life, is the deep understanding of what causes those things and what we can do, to help people in distress. Like maybe stop and realize, hey, you know what? This person's probably really suffering, and maybe a kind word, and maybe being kinder in today's world especially. We should always look for that, and compassion. It seems to be unaccepted in today's society to be compassionate and kind and caring, and it seems like cruelty is okay, Bigotry is okay now, again, And I'm just here to say, Kurt railed against bigotry, hypermasculinity, misogyny, homophobia. He railed against it. He screamed against it in his songs, and his own angst. And I think that the best way to continue forward, or like with John Lennon, imagine people who had dreams, these artists that had dreams, to carry on that dream for them, to promote those things of love and inclusion and kindness. We need more of it. To love ourselves, because to love myself is to love you, and to love you is to love myself. So kind of like it's a figure eight, it's reciprocity. I know I'm going on some philosophical rant, but I thought this last video, I really wanted to make it count for something. That this is more than just a story about a singer-songwriter and a band. It's much more than that. It's all of us. It's all of our lives, because he was just a person, and they were just people, and I'm just a person, and you're people too. And so when we realize how connected we are and how we influence each other and impact each other by what we say and what we create and all of that, you realize your story, no matter what your story is just as important as anybody else's story, whether they're famous, rich, poor, black, white, green, red, whatever. You matter, and we all matter, and everything matters. So I just want to say thank you for coming along with this journey. And I know I kind of rambled on. There was a lot to say, and I didn't quite know how to say it, you know. But I appreciate your time, and go out there and do good. Always do good, do the best you can, and work towards the highest good for yourself and for your fellow beings. You take care now, and we'll see you later.